This is the last in our series on foundations for a society. We are in Genesis chapter 50, the last chapter in the book of Genesis. And we called it Foundations Revisited. This talks about the burial of Jacob and later the death of Joseph down in Egypt. And we're also going to review something you may not be aware of, and is God's covenants with humanity. And this comes very important when you think about it, because even with what's going on with Israel today, God has a covenant with Israel, a covenant that deals with the nation, a covenant that deals with the land, and we'll see that in a little bit. Genesis chapter 50. The burial of Jacob, remember Jacob and all the family, 70, went down into Egypt. 400 years later, they would come out with 2 million Jewish people under Moses to go and resettle the land. Moses would not resettle the land because of some of his disobedience to God, but Joshua would be the one to take the new nation of Israel into the land. So when we come to Genesis chapter 50, Joseph threw himself on his father after he died and wept over him and kissed him. Then Joseph directed the physicians in his service to embalm his father Israel. So the physicians embalmed him, taking a full 40 days, for that was the time required for embalming. Technically, it was between 30 and 40 days. And the Egyptians mourned for him for 70 days. That was out of respect for Joseph. Bible Knowledge Commentary says the Egyptians mourned for Joseph 70 days, 2.5 months, just 2 days short of the normal time of mourning for a pharaoh. So they elevated him to that level. And this showed the great respect that these Egyptians had for Joseph, because he was the second in command behind Pharaoh there in the book of Genesis. And Joseph requests to bury his father in Canaan. Remember, Jacob said, "Don't bury me here. I don't want ultimately to remain here. I want to remain in Canaan, or in the land of Palestine or Israel." When the days of mourning had passed, Joseph said to Pharaoh's court, "If I have found favor in your eyes, speak to Pharaoh for me. Tell him, my father made me swear an oath and said, I am about to die. Bury me in the tomb I dug for myself in the land of Canaan. Now let me go up and bury my father, and then I will return." What you'll find out later is that Joseph dies. His bones remain in Egypt for a time, but then he made them swear to carry his bones after the decay to the promised land. Pharaoh said, "Go up and bury your father as he made you swear to do." A lot of respect here from the Pharaoh. Incidentally, there's very, very little mention in Egyptian records of Jacob or Joseph, or very little of even the tribe of Israel. So Joseph went up to bury his father. All Pharaoh's officials accompany him, the dignitaries of his court, and all the dignitaries of Egypt. Tremendous. This would be like a lying in state burial that we do for many of our dignitaries in the United States or around the world. Besides all the members of Joseph's household and his brothers and those belonging to his father's household. Only their children and their flocks and their herds were left in Goshen. Remember, Goshen is that area up by the Nile, away from Egypt, but part of Egypt. But so the Egyptians, because they did not associate with herdsmen, with shepherds, they relegated them to that particular area so that they could populate that area and grow and prosper. And that was part of God's plan to bring this nation of 70 out to 2 million under Moses 400 years later. Chariots and horsemen also went up with him. It was a very large company, so this was a great procession that was going on. The Bible Knowledge Commentary again says this was Joseph's first time back in the homeland in 39 years. For 40 years he hadn't been there. He had been in Egypt 22 years before Jacob moved there, and Jacob had lived there for 17 years before he passed away. Centuries later, the children of Israel would leave Egypt again, taking with them the bones of the patriarch Joseph himself. Here, however, the sojourn into the land of promise was temporary. The grave was a claim to the land of promise. God had promised Jacob that he would return him to the land and that Joseph would bury him. So God had a plan and a promise. When they reached the threshing floor of Atad, near the Jordan, they lamented loudly and bitterly, and there Joseph observed a 7-day period of mourning for his father. There was already 70 days for the Egyptians. At the threshing floor of Atad, they said, "The Egyptians are holding a solemn ceremony of mourning." This made a great effect on the residents around. That is why that place near the Jordan is called Abel Mizraim. So Jacob's sons did as he had commanded them. They carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in a cave in the field of Machpelah near Mamre, which Abraham had bought along with the field as a burial place from Ephron the Hittite. And if you remember, until the 1940s, nobody knew. In fact, archaeologists denied that the Hittites ever existed, but the Bible talked about them. And then they did some archaeological discoveries in the 1940s and found out, yes, there were a group of people known as the Hittites. Abraham knew them, and he bought a field and a cave from them. After burying his father, Joseph returned to Egypt together with his brothers and all the others who had gone with him to bury his father. Now, just so you can see, this is the funeral procession coming from this area. Here's Egypt, here's Goshen up in this area. Going up here along, they would go through what you see in the news every day, the Gaza Strip, over to this area around Hebron, south of Jerusalem, about 5 miles south of Jerusalem, and there would be the burial place. Hebron was also one of the areas that David claimed as king. Joseph's brothers are worried about Joseph, that he would hold a grudge after Jacob's death. Remember all the deceit, all the dysfunction? We're talking about the foundations of a society, and this was a very, very dysfunctional family. And God, out of that dysfunction, blessed them, and not because of the dysfunction, but through it all, blessed them and did his plan. Verse 15, when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him?" Remember what they did? He had the coat of many colors. They sold him. They put him in a pit first. Reuben was going to come back and rescue him, and he wasn't there, and they sold him into slavery down into Egypt. He went to prison down there. He suffered down there. He became elevated to the right hand of Pharaoh. And it says, your father left these instructions before he died. They're saying this. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Knowing this family, that might have happened. I don't know if it did happen. I'm going to ask the brothers when I get there whether Jacob actually said this. He might have, because he had learned a lot about grace. He had learned a lot about forgiveness. He had learned a lot about faith in God. And he may have said, go to Joseph and say, don't hold a grudge. But they might have been saying it anyway, just because that was their nature. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of your God, of your father. So they're asking for forgiveness. And when their message came to him, Joseph wept. Remember, there are about 6 or 7 times where Joseph weeps about his father, his brothers, the reuniting, all of that. And it was a great emotional time. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. We are your slaves, they said. We'll become your servants. Joseph had the power over those brothers. He could have executed them. He could have put them in prison. He could have done anything he wanted because he was the right-hand man to Pharaoh. But instead, because of grace and forgiveness, Joseph reassures his brothers that he would not hold a grudge. He had learned forgiveness as his father had learned forgiveness. Verse 19. But Joseph said to him, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God?" That's a great thing to do with forgiveness. See, when you refuse to forgive, you put yourself in the place of God. When you harbor a grudge, you put yourself in the place of God. And God says, vengeance is his, it's not ours. And so Joseph knew this, and he said, am I in the place of God? Am I the one who can grant forgiveness or not grant forgiveness? I'm not God. You intended to harm me, that's a fact. But God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done. Out of a bad situation, Joseph is saying, look at the good that's come out of it. God has orchestrated this. And we've learned all through Genesis, even in dysfunctional societies, even in foundations that are eroding, God is working behind the scenes for good. God is working to accomplish his purposes, and he does it through individuals and the saving of many lives, particularly the nation of Israel. There were several times in the Old Testament, one was with Joseph, if the brothers did not respond, that God would have started a new nation, not with the 12 tribes of Israel, but with Joseph and his descendants. But the brothers responded and forgiveness came. Later on in the life of Moses, we find the same thing happening. The children of Israel sin, they make a golden calf. Moses comes down and God says, I'm going to destroy the whole nation and start over with you, Moses. And Moses appeals to God and he says, God, if you do that, what are the nations going to say? What are all the surrounding heathen nations that look to you, God, that look to Israel as an example, even though they were a poor example? What are you going to do? And so it says God relented of destroying Israel altogether. And he made a promise. He had made a promise to Abraham, and Moses called on him to keep that promise. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. There was something in the heart of Joseph that was very, very kind. And many years later, this chapter records the death of Joseph. So Joseph stayed in Egypt along with all his father's family. He lived 110 years and saw the third generation of Ephraim's children. Remember what we said the other week? That Ephraim and Manasseh were the two tribes. In the settling of the land, later on in Joshua 19, there is no tribe of Joseph. There's Reuben, there's Judah, there's a land allotment to all of those. But no land allotment to Joseph because it's split between Ephraim, Joseph's son, born in Egypt, and Manasseh, Joseph's other son, born in Egypt, that Jacob claimed for himself. Also the children of Machir, son of Manasseh, the grandchildren, were placed at birth on Joseph's knees. So he got to see his children in the third generation, his grandchildren. Then Joseph said to his brothers, I am about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And we're going to talk about those oaths, those covenants, in a little bit. And Joseph made the Israelites swear an oath and said, God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place. So Joseph died at the age of 110, and after they embalmed him, he was placed in a coffin in Egypt. And later, when the children of Israel, 400 years later, when they traveled, they would take Joseph's bones with them. So that's some of the history in God curing and working with what is our human nature in our dysfunctional society. Joseph lived to see his great-great-grandchildren by Ephraim and his great-grandchildren by Manasseh. Placing them on his knees at their birth was a gesture signifying they belonged to him. Then Joseph died at 110, like Jacob was embalmed. Abraham lived to be 175, Isaac 180, and Jacob 147. The book of Genesis closes with the promise of the land, yet unfulfilled, but with expectation of a visitation on high from God. Now, you may not know these, but God has always done covenants with the people of the earth. And they're throughout the book of Genesis, they're throughout the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch. You'll find them in Jeremiah, you'll find them other places. But I want to take a moment because God is a covenanting God. What's the difference between a contract and a covenant? In a contract, you sign on the dotted line, and the person that's making the contract with you signs on the dotted line. And if you violate that, there are legal obligations. A covenant is different. A covenant is when you say, I will do this regardless. If you treat me badly, I will still treat you good. That's what God is saying. God knew that Israel would fail. God knew that his people would fail in all of these covenants. But he remained faithful. And if you look, beginning in Genesis, the first one, we did this back in Genesis chapters 1, 2, and 3, the Adamic covenant, and it's the beginning and the failure of mankind in God's covenant with them. The Adamic covenant can be thought of in 2 parts. The Edenic, which is the Garden of Eden covenant, innocence, and the Adamic covenant, grace, in Genesis chapter 3. The Edenic covenant is found in Genesis chapter 1. The Edenic covenant outlines man's responsibility toward creation and God's directive regarding the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That's from gotquestions.org. So that was a time of innocence, but we know that didn't last very long. The Adamic covenant, on the other hand, included the curses pronounced against mankind for the sin of Adam and Eve, as well as God's provision for that sin in Genesis chapter 3:15. Genesis 3:15 is the first hint of a Messiah. It's the first hint that God would send someone to rescue our broken society, including Israel, including the nations that were dysfunctional. The second one in Genesis is the Noahic covenant. Things have gotten so very bad that by Genesis chapter 5 and 6 and even up to chapter 9, there's a restart through the flood. The Noahic covenant was an unconditional covenant between God and Noah specifically, and humanity generally. After the flood, God promised humanity that he would never again destroy all life on earth with a flood. God gave the rainbow as a sign of the covenant, a promise that the entire earth would never again flood, and a reminder that God can and will judge sin. And God judges it by fire in 2 Peter chapter 2 and verse 5. The third covenant was the Abrahamic covenant, comes in Genesis chapter 12, and that's about the nation of Israel. Genesis chapter 12, verse 1, the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you." How are we blessed today? Because of Abraham and the Abrahamic covenant. We're blessed because out of the Jews, out of the descendants of Abraham, Jesus Christ from the tribe of Judah came as the Messiah. Not only that, we're blessed because it was through the Jewish people that we got the scriptures, the Old Testament scriptures, and the prophets, and everything that told us what God was doing. And so this is a great covenant, even though it's on the nation of Israel, and that nation will never end. There are some theologians who think that the church replaced Israel. Not true. Israel has a future, And you're going to see that future in the millennial kingdom. You're going to see that future in the book of Revelation. And so they are two separate, distinct entities. And don't confuse. There are a lot of people who say, well, you know, Israel and the nation and the covenant, that was Old Testament, and now God is only working with the replacement, the church. They're not a replacement. It's a temporary time for 2,000 plus years. It's a parenthesis. It's an intervening time. But God is, and you can see it in the news, God is picking his program back up. It's happened since 1948. I don't know how long it will be before God wraps it up. The rapture could take place today. You and I could disappear, and then all of that would begin. I don't know the timetable, and anybody that tells you they know the timetable doesn't know what they're talking about. They don't know the scriptures. They're assuming on the scriptures. But the Abrahamic covenant was one for a nation that would bless all other nations. The Palestinian covenant, and don't be thrown by this word Palestinian, the land. But guess who the land was deeded to? Deuteronomy chapter 30. There were Canaanites before. They called it the land of Palestine. When all these blessings and curses I have set before you come on you, and you take them to heart wherever the Lord your God disperses you among the nations. We know about the dispersion. They didn't come back until 1948, but there have been other dispersions into Assyria, into Babylonia, other things. And here's this second generation in Deuteronomy preparing for Joshua to take them into the land. And God is saying, even if you're dispersed, I'm going to bring you back to the land. Take them to heart wherever the Lord your God disperses you among the nations. And when you and your children return to the Lord your God and obey him with all your heart and with all your soul, according to everything I command you today, then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and have compassion on you and gather you again from all the nations where he scattered you. We've seen that actually happen in history. There's more of that to happen. Deuteronomy 30, verse 4. Even if you have been banished to the most distant land under the heavens, from there the Lord your God will gather you and bring you back. He will bring you to the land that belonged to your ancestors. This is the promise of the land. And you will take possession of it. He will make you more prosperous and numerous than your ancestors. The Lord your God will circumcise your hearts and the hearts of your descendants. That's a future thing. That has to do with the new covenant. So that you may love him with all your heart and with all your soul and live. And what did Jesus say? What's the first commandment? To love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your might, and to love your neighbor as yourself. Fifth, the Davidic covenant. This is the throne of the Davidic kingdom when King David. Remember, you've got three kings there in Israel, Saul, David, and Solomon. 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 10. And I will provide a place for my people Israel and will plant them so that they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. Is this not a message for today? Wicked people will not oppress them anymore as they did at the beginning. That has not happened yet, but it will happen. And have done ever since the time I appointed leaders over my people Israel. I will also give you rest from all your enemies. The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. That's the house of David, the kingdom, the throne of David. And David will be back. You know, just like Jesus will be back, David will be back to be a regent, a ruler in the millennial kingdom. 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 12. When your days are over and you rest with your ancestors, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you. He's talking about the lineage of Christ. your own flesh and blood, and I will establish his kingdom. He's not only talking about David's son Solomon, but he's talking into the futures. Prophets could do that. They could do a near prophecy about what would happen, and they could do something that would be hundreds or thousands of years from that time. He is the one who will build a house for my name. That's Jesus. And I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. It was also Solomon, because Solomon got to build the temple as a house. The promise that David and his seed would be kings fulfilled the even more ancient Abrahamic covenant blessing that the patriarchs would be the fathers of kings. To Judah, great-grandson of Abraham, was given the explicit pledge that a promised ruler would come from Judah. Samuel anointed this one from Judah, David himself, of whom the Lord said, he is my son. So it's near prophecy and far prophecy, and a lot of people don't understand that. David was aware of his election by God and of the theological significance that that election, as part of the messianic line, that would result in a divine descendant and king, talking about Jesus. Ethan's words, the prophet also attested to the David Messiah, the one who would rule over all and forever on his throne. As for a temple, David would not be allowed to build it, but his son Solomon, after him, would have the honor of doing so. That this refers to a literal house and not a dynasty is clear from the context, which speaks of the results that would follow if the son would be disobedient to the Lord. This could not be true of the king who is spoken of as a climactic figure of the David dynastic line. That meant Jesus is coming. These verses, then, are a good example of an Old Testament passage in which some elements find fulfillment, near prophecy, in the immediate future, Solomon and other strictly human descendants of David, while other elements will be realized only in the more distant future, talking about Jesus Christ, the Messiah, who is in the lineage as a son of David. The sixth one, and there's only one more, the Mosaic covenant, the blessing and the cursing. The Mosaic covenant under Moses in Deuteronomy 11 was a conditional covenant that either brought God's direct blessing for obedience or God's direct cursing for disobedience upon the nation of Israel. It was dependent on them behaving. Mosaic covenant, the blessing and the cursing. Part of the Mosaic covenant was the 10 Commandments, and the rest of the law, which contained over 600 commands, 613 to be exact, roughly 300 positive and 300 negatives. Do this, don't do this. The history books of the Old Testament, Joshua through Esther, detail how Israel succeeded at obeying the law or how Israel failed miserably at obeying the law. And they failed miserably at it, just like all dysfunctional societies do. And then finally, this is the one we're looking forward to. This is the one we will be under in the future, the new covenant, forgiveness and new hearts. The new covenant comes from Jeremiah 31, is a covenant made first with the nation of Israel and ultimately with all mankind. In the new covenant, God promises to forgive sin, and there will be a universal knowledge of the Lord. The Bible says everyone will know the Lord. Jesus Christ came to fulfill the law of Moses and create a new covenant between God and his people. Now that we are under the new covenant, both Jews and Gentiles can be free from the penalty of the law. But we're not there yet. We won't totally be there until Jesus returns. I want to conclude with this. At the second coming, when Jesus returns to establish his kingdom for 1,000 years, these covenants will be fulfilled as Israel is regathered from the nations, according to Matthew chapter 24, converted, Zechariah 12 says they all turn to the Lord, and restored to the land under the rule of Messiah, Jesus Christ. That day is coming. I live for that day. I mean, if you've heard me preach more than once, you know that my excitement is the coming kingdom of God. And some theologians think that somehow we've ushered in the kingdom by all of our, quote, righteousness and our good behavior and our civil laws and everything else, and we're enjoying that now. Wake up and look around. We're not enjoying that. It hasn't come yet. The world is a dysfunctional society. There's global chaos, and it's going to be that way until the Lord Jesus raptures us out of here, and then after the tribulation period returns with us to establish his kingdom on earth. Now, I'm thankful for the rules, the laws, the civility that we have maintained as a country. And I want to close with a song, because this is still the greatest nation that ever was in the existence of the world. And God needs to keep blessing us, but God will only bless us if we follow his principles.